Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching this. So it's week 2. This is the week 2 lecture. And you can see from the title, it's How Do I Know My Water is Clean? And we'll get to that. But the overall theme of this lecture is actually a bit more focused on nutrients, where nutrients come from, and the impacts that they can cause on the environment. And so we touched on this a bit in week 1. Right, so we talked about how excess nutrients can lead to algae blooms, such as shown in the image here on the right, and some of the implications that can have. So we're going to dig into that a little more deeply, focusing on the nitrogen cycle. Now, on the left here, there's another image. Okay, now this is actually a photo of a large explosion that occurred in Tianjin, China in 2015. And there's actually a curious link between massive explosions that often occur in urban and industrialized areas and eutrophication. Now, when I taught this unit last year, it was quite timely because in 2020, right about this time, there was a huge explosion in Beirut. And this occurred right sort of in the waterfront next to the CBD. And because it was in such a populated area, there was plenty of footage, a lot of cell phone videos of this blast. And as I was preparing for the lecture today, I actually came across another article about that. So here we are 1 year on from that explosion, and they are still sort of investigating, although we do know what the cause of it is, and I'll get to that in a moment. But now it's just a matter of pointing fingers and trying to assign blame for all of this destruction. So explosions like this, they pop up in the news every couple of years. So in 2013, there was a large explosion at a farm supply store in West Texas. So West is actually the name of the town, not in Western Texas. And you can see there's a row of apartment blocks here, which were completely destroyed. No one was killed there, although 15 firefighters sadly lost their lives during this blast. In 2015, in Tianjin, China, a similar explosion occurred, and I don't know how many fatalities there were, but there was a number of particularly first responders who sadly lost their lives. And then, of course, the Beirut explosion in 2020. If you want to know more about that or see the footage, which is quite spectacular, there's a few links here. And I'm not showing or talking about this, to be morbid or anything like that, but rather to raise awareness about an important issue, which quite interestingly connects to the content that we're covering in this unit. Okay, so what is the connection then between these explosions and water quality? This is another photo, which actually contains a clue to that question. Okay, so we're back in Beirut. This is the aftermath, I think the day after the explosion. The epicenter was about right here, I think, along the dock. And this concrete structure here, which is destroyed, these were grain silos. And so you can see all the grain that has spilled out. Okay, so what's the link here? Well, it has to do with grain and agriculture. So yeah, if we're coming back to this photo here, this is grain, but when we zoom in more closely, we can see that it's corn. Okay, and so corn in particular is a crop that requires a lot of nitrogen. Okay, so nitrogen fertilizer usually comes in 2 forms. I'll move my video out of the way here. Nitrogen fertilizer comes in 2 forms. It comes in a solid form, ammonium nitrate. And so oftentimes this stuff is stored in vast quantities, particularly when it's being stockpiled. And it also comes in the form of anhydrous ammonia. So the anhydrous just means no water. So you can see in this tank here, which is attached to a drill being pulled by a tractor, this pure liquid ammonia is actually inserted into the ground, where the nitrogen then sticks to soil particles and can then be accessed by plants. But the thing about this ammonium nitrate is that we have nitrogen in a reduced form, and we have another nitrogen in the same compound that is highly oxidized. So we have a strong reductant and a strong oxidant in the same compound, and that's just a recipe for an energetic compound. And the product of this, if you add a little bit of heat, is N2 gas plus water, which, under the heat, it will be a vapor, a gas. And so when gases are the products of a chemical reaction, you can have expansion, and that's exactly what an explosion is. Now, in most developing countries, ammonium nitrate is commonly used as a fertilizer. In most of it depends a little bit, but in general, in most of the developed world, anhydrous ammonia is used. And it's primarily used for corn production, because corn's got to have nitrogen. Not all crops require extra nitrogen being added to soil, but corn does. If you want to have high yields and you want to produce lots of grain to feed the world's growing population. And so it's actually, I was going to call it funny, but it's actually kind of serious. But there was a time when nitrogen almost killed me, because in a former life, I used to work on my grandparents' farm, and we used to work with these large tanks of anhydrous ammonia, and they are incredibly dangerous. And there was a time when one of those tanks almost killed me. So if you want to know that story, go have a look on my YouTube channel. It's all there. And yeah, one of these days, I would like to make a video about my biochar project as well. So if the subscribers get up to, let's say, 100, then I'll make a video about biochar. There's one on the channel already, but I'll make a more scientific video with a bit more detail and SciComm built in there. All right, so that brings us to our learning outcomes for today, or for the week rather. So we're going to talk about the causes and consequences of eutrophication, mainly how that excess nitrogen that we add to soil for agriculture can lead to some of these environmental problems and degradation of water quality. And to do that, we're going to talk about how humans and microbes can impact the nitrogen cycle. Now, this third learning outcome, I'll touch on it at the very end, but this third learning outcome is going to be primarily for our tutorial this week, in which we'll talk a bit about isotopes and how we can use them as tracers for determining the sources of nutrients in water. All right, but coming back to the title, well, how do I know my water is clean? The answer to that is fairly simple. You measure it. So you measure water quality parameters in your water sample, and then you compare them to various guidelines. Now, you'll recall from the week 1 practical that we have a couple of ways to assess water quality, or rather there's different types of guidelines. There's the ANZAC guidelines, which refer to thresholds which can lead to degradation of recreational waters or waters that are important for ecosystems. And we also have the Australian drinking water guidelines. And so the drinking water guidelines are more about water that humans are actually going to consume. Okay, these are regulated a bit differently from the ANZAC guidelines. But in any regards, if we have a sample and we know a bit about what's in it and some of its other properties, such as pH, we can compare those to the guidelines. And if they fall within the guidelines, then it should be safe to drink. Now, this sort of ignores the fact that the water could contain microbial pathogens as well, but that's sort of a separate issue. Well, actually, no, I mean, in drinking water, they do assess for microbes as well, such as E. coli. So if we look at pH, for example, pH 7.9, that falls within the range. And there's a few of these parameters that exceed the guidelines. Turbidity, for example, is a bit high. It exceeds the aesthetic value. There's real no health value here, however. And in some of these compounds, there isn't, you'll recall from part 3 in the week 1 prac, that there's different reasons for the regulation. So for things which tend to have a toxic effect on humans, lead would be a good example. I think we all are somewhat familiar with lead in that we know that it's not something that you want to ingest as a human. There's clearly a health value set for this. For other compounds, such as iron, there is no health value. And the reason for that is because iron is not something that's particularly toxic. And in fact, I was talking with some of you at the prac that in your home, the water comes out of the tap sometimes, and it's sort of brown or orange in color. And in most instances, that color is the result of rust coming out of the pipes in your home when they corrode. I had that problem as well at the former house I lived in Glen Waverly. And so you can drink a lot of iron. It's not going to kill you or even harm you, but it tastes bad. And so they do regulate things like that in drinking water for the aesthetic value, because nobody wants to drink brown water, and nobody likes a metallic taste either, right? Okay, so let's talk about nutrients in particular, because nutrients are a bit unique in that most of them, there's a few exceptions. It depends on the form of nitrogen as to whether it's toxic or not, because something like, let's get my pen, it's working, thankfully. Nitrate, which is one form of nitrogen, actually can be toxic, okay? And so that has a regulated health value. Ammonia or ammonium, okay, basically the same thing, but its form will depend on pH. This one is not regulated from a health perspective, but does have an aesthetic limit in drinking water. Now, so drinking water can be treated somewhat separately from natural ecosystems, because while it might be okay to have a certain amount of ammonium in your drinking water, when these compounds are out in the environment, they might not have a toxic effect on humans or other organisms. But what they do is they lead to this, okay? They lead to a bloom of algae. Essentially, there can be too much of a good thing. Okay, so in general, the more nutrients we have in an ecosystem, the more growth of primary producers we're going to have. So photosynthetic organisms, i.e. algae. And excess nutrients are largely our fault. The reason for that is because natural systems tend to have, they tend to be well balanced. There is heaps of nitrogen in the air. Most of us probably know this, right? Like every time you take a breath of air, 78% of that air we breathe is nitrogen, but it's in the form of N2. Now, this form of nitrogen is not able to be assimilated by organisms. So it's quite useless. But there are ways in which N2 can be converted to ammonium, and then it can be taken up into organisms like a happy little bacteria here. And then that can go into plants, and then humans eat plants, and that's how we get our nitrogen, right? So excess nutrients are usually the result of anthropogenic activities, such as agriculture, waste from homes like septic tanks or wastewater treatment plants, or even industrial activities. Okay, so why is this a problem? Well, aesthetics for one. Why do we care about a bunch of algae? Some people like the color green, and you might like to see green stuff floating on water. But what we don't like to see are dead fish floating on water. This perturbs the ecological balance as well, right? So normally there would be a steady state balanced system where there's some algae growing. Some of that algae might be consumed by larger organisms. Phytoplankton, for example, can be eaten by zooplankton. Fish might eat those zooplankton. Big fish eat little fish. Okay, but if this system gets thrown out of balance, if all of a sudden all of these phytoplankton and algae take over, it just swamps out everything else. In addition to that, some of these algae and other microorganisms that come along with algae blooms can be toxic, right? So what's a microbe? This is sort of biology 101 stuff here, right? A microbe is any microscopic organism. This can consist of not just bacteria, but also fungi. And of course, well, wait a minute, this isn't a microscopic organism, but there are microscopic fungi, such as yeast, right? Viruses. When I was in uni, I think it was still a matter of debate about whether viruses actually were considered a living organism or not. So yeah, I'm not really sure what the consensus there is, or whether that's still a debate going on in the biology community. I guess that's a good question for Google. If anyone knows, leave a comment in the comment section for the video. I'd be curious to see what you think. Algae. Okay, so there are macroscopic algae, but oftentimes a lot of these algae consist of massive aggregates of microscopic algae, such as cyanobacteria, which tend to form these large filaments, which we can see with the naked eye. And there's a few other classes of microbes as well. Protozoa. So protozoa would be single-celled eukaryotes. They tend to be animal-like, even though they're not technically animals. So I think an example of that would be like amoebas, which are really cool. And then archaea. You may not have heard of these, but these are similar to bacteria, but their lineage is a bit older, and they tend to do some, they can carry out some pretty cool metabolisms. And so when I say lineage, I'm talking about the tree of life, right? So, at some point it's thought that we all were part of one common ancestor, and over time, evolution has led to a great diversity of organisms on the planet that carry out diverse metabolisms and have some quite remarkable traits. It's not really clear from this diagram, but the overwhelming majority of all organisms are actually microbes. This isn't to scale here, but things like plants, fungi, and animals make up actually a very small proportion of the different organisms on this planet. All right, now some of these algae I mentioned are toxic. And one in particular is called Nodularia. Okay, so this is a genus of cyanobacteria. So cyanobacteria are a large group of single-celled photosynthetic organisms, right? So they're green because they got chlorophyll and they utilize sunlight to carry out photosynthesis, which is where you convert carbon dioxide and water to organic matter or carbohydrates and oxygen as a waste product. Okay, so yeah, that's great, right? Photosynthesis is wonderful, produces oxygen, but some of these cyanobacteria also produce toxic compounds. And so these folks are named after a toxic compound they produce called nodularin. And you can actually look this up in the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines, and they do have a bit of information about it. Interestingly, it is not regulated in drinking water in Australia, even though it's known to be quite toxic. And we know algae blooms are quite a problem in a number of water bodies in Australia as well. There's a note here. It says the relevant health authority should be notified immediately. Okay, well, that's not very concrete, right? It doesn't say must, it says should. Perhaps whoever wrote these guidelines should pay more attention to the wording there, but or maybe they have, and there really is no legal requirement that forces anyone, that makes them that they must do anything, which is a bit unfortunate for communities who might be exposed to such blooms. The World Health Organization does regulate this compound, though. And this actually is quite, so some of you might be familiar with Friendly Jordies, who's a big YouTuber. I'm not necessarily trying to plug him or anything like that, but he had a interesting documentary recently looking at water use in the Murray-Darling Basin. And it's coming to mind now because they actually had a segment on algae blooms in the drinking water supply for a town called Griffith in New South Wales. And a lot of the folks in that community display some rather unusual symptoms, which they think are tied to algae blooms and potentially the toxins that algae blooms produce. But it was coming to mind, and I remember it as well because Griffith is where I actually got Jack from. So I've actually been up to that community, but it was sort of sad to learn though that they are victims of poor water quality. So it's real, it happens in Australia. We're a developed nation, but we're not immune from these problems. Okay, so in addition to producing toxic compounds, microbes themselves can be pathogens. Now, E. coli is a good example, and E. coli is often an indicator of fecal contamination, so human and animal waste. And quite interestingly, you can see a rather significant increase in the amount of E. coli as you sample the Yarra River from some of its upper reaches here, closer to Healesville and Launching Place. I can't see this because it's cropped off, but you're eventually going up to like the Warburton area and the headwaters. But as you follow the Yarra downstream, which would be right to left on this diagram, where eventually you get to docklands here in the CBD, the amount of E. coli increases. And indeed, if you just go and look at a map and follow the Yarra, it's quite clear that as you progress downstream, the level of urbanization increases. And so there's more opportunities for there to be agricultural runoff, perhaps in places like some of these areas on the right side of the diagram here. These are still somewhat rural but there could be agricultural contamination from animal waste. And then as we get into the more urban areas, there's a greater potential for human waste to get into the river, the runoff. And it kind of comes back to the what I mentioned in one of the week 1 lectures as well, which is, in the upper reaches of the Yarra, it's a bit cleaner, mainly just looking at the turbidity, right? There's very little suspended stuff in the water. And that seems like a place where you might want to swim in the river. But once we get down to, say, Southgate and Docklands, the Yarra is a very different river. It's got a bit more turbidity, and apparently it also has a bit more E. coli. So not exactly a river I would want to take a dip in. All right, so microbes. So this sort of just comes to metabolisms, and what do microbes or all living things need to grow? Well, they need food, right? And so there's 2 ways to get food. You either make it or you take it. So the organisms that make their own food, these are called autotrophs. Okay, so autotrophs are photosynthetic organisms. And so to make your own food, you often need an external energy source. In this case, light is what drives photosynthesis. And so autotrophs, they make their own carbohydrates, they make their own food, which they can then use to carry out respiration. Those organisms that take it, they are called heterotrophs. Okay, so heterotrophy refers to the actual metabolism. Okay, so heterotrophs would be pretty much everything other than a photosynthesizer. Okay, so us humans, we're heterotrophs. We cannot make our own food. We have to rely on plants for our food or animals for our food. But of course, animals that we eat need to eat plants ultimately to gain the nutrients and the energy source. Right, and so essentially our energy source comes from chemical reactions. We essentially burn carbon. We burn organic matter through respiration, where carbon is oxidized with the oxygen, the O2 that we breathe. Okay, so you remember those metabolisms, right? They were in the week 1. Photosynthesis and respiration, the perhaps 2 most important chemical reactions on our planet. Okay, but remember, we're more than just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We also need nitrogen. In fact, nitrogen is probably the most important element after those other ones. Nitrogen is part of our DNA. It makes up a number of proteins in our cells, and without it, we would not exist. Okay, but I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that we can't simply breathe in nitrogen from the air. The reason for that is because nitrogen, or N2 in the air, has a structure as shown here. Essentially, there's 2 nitrogen atoms which have a triple bond, and this triple bond is very, very difficult to break. Okay, so essentially, it's inert. Now, there are a group of bacteria which are able to break this triple bond, and they can convert nitrogen from the atmosphere into a form of nitrogen which can be assimilated into the biosphere. Now, this can only be carried out by bacteria. Even plants are unable to fixate their own nitrogen. Okay, this is actually a microbial process. And I tell you what, if photosynthesis is the most important reaction on Earth, nitrogen fixation would probably come in at number 2. Without nitrogen fixation, life on Earth would not exist as we know it today. Now, the interesting thing about these nitrogen-fixing bacteria is that they often form symbiotic relationships with plants. So plants themselves don't fixate nitrogen, the bacteria do. But nitrogen fixing organisms will often associate with the root structures of particular types of plants. And they sort of work in harmony to the nitrogen fixing bacteria feed the plant with nitrogen. And then the bacteria then sort of use some of the excreted compounds in the root zone, and they use that as a food source. So it's a rather fascinating relationship. Not all plants do this. Special plants do this. A main group that we know of is legumes. So things like clover, but also beans would be another good example. And this sort of comes back to the beginning of the lecture when I was talking about corn. Corn does not form these symbiotic relationships. And so corn requires a lot of extra nitrogen being put on the soil to get high yields. Things like soybeans, however, form these lovely relationships with nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil. And so you do not need to add extra nitrogen fertilizer when farming soybeans. Okay, so corn, bad from a nitrogen perspective, beans, good from a nitrogen perspective. But you can actually see the impact of this, or the benefit of having nitrogen fixing plants on a field. So this is a soccer field here, and this is an experimental area. On the left, this is a grass field, grass turf here. And but on the left, they've mixed clover in with the grass. And on the right, it is grass only. And depending upon how your monitor settings are, you might need to take a close look. But what we can see here on the left is that where the clover is, everything's a bit greener, it's a bit lusher. On the right, things are looking a bit more yellow. The grass isn't all that happy. And grass, like corn, is unable to fix its own nitrogen, okay? So it has to just rely on whatever nitrogen may be present in the soil. You can sort of see that similar impact here. This is a construction site, and a lot of the topsoil was removed, and with it went the nitrogen. And it looks like it's struggling to be revegetated, but the areas that are looking nice and lush are the ones that have clover. So this clover is perfectly happy growing here because even though the soil is depleted in nitrogen, it's able to fix its own. And so it still looks green and lush. All right, yeah, so a few other details here about how this occurs. Not super important, other than I would note that molybdenum, which is a trace element, is required for nitrogen fixation. So it's quite fascinating to think about how some obscure element on the periodic table, which is of really low abundance, certainly in soil, that's actually required to fixate nitrogen and create the planet that we live on. Okay, so bacteria fixate nitrogen, but guess what? Humans also fixate nitrogen, okay? And one of the main way in which humans fixate nitrogen, that was a little tricky when I said it before. I said only bacteria can fixate nitrogen. Well, humans can do it, but not naturally. We can do it synthetically through an industrial chemical process, okay? So not quite the same thing as being able to just breathe in the air and turn it into nitrogen within our own bodies, right? Nope, instead, in large industrial complexes, we can take nitrogen and react it with hydrogen under extremely high temperatures and pressures to make ammonia. Okay, so this is called the Haber-Bosch process. Now, this is really something here. So the Haber-Bosch process is responsible for producing essentially all of the ammonia that's used as fertilizer in agriculture. And in fact, most of this ammonia is used as fertilizer. Some of it is used for other minor industrial chemicals through further chemical syntheses. Now, a couple interesting things here. Roughly 2 to 3% of all of the world's energy consumption is due to this process. Okay, so all the energy that humans are expending around the globe, 2 to 3% of it is to make ammonia, primarily for fertilizer and agriculture. The Haber-Bosch process is also emits more CO2 than any other chemical making process. Okay, so if you're concerned about atmospheric CO2 and climate change, this chemical process emits more CO2 than any other chemical process, which is quite remarkable. And the reason for that is because of the high temperatures and pressures required to drive this reaction forward. Okay, so this is not an energetically favorable process. We need to put energy in to get our product. And this hydrogen here is also derived from fossil fuels. So it's sort of a 1-2 punch there. Yeah, so what we can see is that following World War II, that's when the Haber-Bosch process really began to be utilized. We went through this thing called the Green Revolution, where we started applying more synthetic fertilizers to produce bigger yields. And you know, in many regards, you could probably attribute the Haber-Bosch process to the growth in the world's, the exponential growth of the world's population post-World War II. Now, a lot of good has come from that. We've perhaps not eliminated, but certainly minimized and decreased hunger and starvation in a lot of countries around the world. That's not to say there can't be more to be done, but there's been a lot of positive things that have come from this. Unfortunately, it's come at a cost though, because if we look at global nitrogen fixation, we can see that these synthetic fertilizers are a substantial contributor to nitrogen fixation into the Earth system. And of course, we know that this has some negative consequences as well. And yeah, all of this was the result of this guy named Fritz Haber and his partner, Carl Bosch, who came up with this process. And Fritz Haber, interesting character. He was a German, and during World War I, he was famous for being a proponent of chemical warfare, for example, a proponent of using chlorine gas, you know, during the trench warfare in World War I. He said things like, you know, death is death by whatever means. So what does it matter if it's chemical warfare versus a bullet? You know, he said things like, during peacetime, a scientist belongs to the world, but during wartime, they belong to their country. And so big proponent of German warfare in World War I. And in fact, this Haber-Bosch process allowed for the production of nitrate, because you can convert ammonium to nitrate fairly easily, which can then be used in explosives. Yeah, and ironically, he was Jewish as well. And so once the National Socialists came to power in Germany in the 30s, ironically, the country that he fought for, he left in exile to England. And you might imagine he wasn't very well liked in England, given his efforts to support the German war effort in World War I. All right, so lengthy slide here, but a lot of important stuff. So what happens when we introduce all this extra nitrogen into the environment, when these ecosystems, all these organisms have evolved to binge on nitrogen, right? Because nitrogen is usually hard to come by, but now all of a sudden it's everywhere. Well, the result is eutrophication. Once we introduce extra nutrients, phytoplankton can bloom And remember, there are toxic effects from algae, but one of the big consequences of eutrophication is actually the decay of these algae. So they bloom, they consume the nutrients, and then all of a sudden, the system is nutrient limited, at least to support the number of algae that are there. So they die, they sink to the bottom, and then respiring organisms in bottom waters can consume that organic carbon and oxygen, dissolved oxygen, which lowers DO, which leads to the death of higher order aquatic organisms. So the nutrients themselves, not directly the problem. The main issue that causes ecological harm or would be the toxins from algae and also the reduction of dissolved oxygen. Okay, but as we saw from the drinking water guidelines, phosphorus and nitrogen aren't regulated to protect human health. It's more about ecosystem health. Okay, so how do you know if your water's clean? Well, there's a couple ways to do this. Source tracing is one, and we're gonna go through a few examples of this in the tutorial coming up. In general, we want our water to come from a clean place. Okay, we kind of saw that from the Yarra River example. The upper reaches of the Yarra is coming from natural forested areas. The water is clean, it's not full of E. coli and turbidity. But once you get down to docklands, for example, it's a different story. Lots of E. coli, lots of turbidity. So we're going to talk about some tracer methods, and primarily we'll use isotopes for that. So let's see, this will be very brief. Again, we'll talk about it more in the tutorial. So don't panic if you've never heard about isotopes or what they're useful, why they're useful. But essentially an isotope is a version of an atom with a different mass. Okay, so if we think about carbon, we can have carbon 12 or carbon 13. So these are both carbon, but the carbon 13 has one extra neutron in its nucleus, which makes it a little bit heavier. Okay, so we can actually measure each of these. And you might say, well, why is that useful? It's because they can actually react ever so slightly differently. From a chemical standpoint, these two carbon isotopes are mostly the same, but there is a subtle difference in reactivity. And so some metabolic processes like photosynthesis and respiration can distinguish between these two. So organisms will prefer to use carbon 12 versus carbon 13, for example. And so we can use the ratio of these two to understand, for example, what types of plants are present in a watershed. Okay, so that leaves an isotopic signature. And we'll also look at a very simple mixing model as well. So, let's say you're measuring a river, but that river has many sources. It might branch and you have source A and source B, but source B might be a very different watershed from source A. And so there's ways that you can sort of back out, what is coming from where, which is pretty cool. Okay, so I started by talking about sort of this link between explosions and eutrophication. And what is this link? Well, it's fertilizers and agriculture. So anhydrous ammonia, not necessarily related to the explosions, but ammonium nitrate is, which is also an important fertilizer. Anhydrous ammonia is used throughout the world, especially for growing corn. And in any case, ammonium nitrate or anhydrous ammonia, oftentimes we apply probably more than we need on agricultural land. And certainly we've been fixating nitrogen at an extraordinary rate, which has led to things like eutrophication being a substantial problem throughout the world. All right, so we talked a bit about the causes and consequences of eutrophication. Okay, we talked about how humans and microbes can impact the end cycle. And on, well, I guess either on Monday or Wednesday, depending upon when your toot is, we'll be looking at some isotopic data to better understand metabolic processes and nutrient sources. So that's all for today, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.